education and equalities, leading education and equalities work at the Council for Disabled Children, and we're going to be recording this webinar, as you've just heard on that little notice. So it will be edited, however, before it goes up onto the CDC website. But during the talk, it's sort of in 4 parts, and there'll be pauses in between. And Christina's going to manage those sections for us. So perhaps we could just introduce the rest of the team who are hosting the webinar this afternoon. Christina.
Hi everyone, lovely to see you all here. Hopefully we'll get a few more people joining in the interim, but yeah, I'm Christina Welsh. I'm Programme Manager of the Education team at CDC, and I'll be doing the moderating and the tech for this seminar, and I'll pass on to Charlotte.
Hi everyone, my name is Charlotte. I'm the Project Assistant at CDC in the Education and Equalities team, and I'll be here assisting Philippa and Christina with anything that they need today.
Thanks very much indeed. And we'll have a chance to, I can't see you all at the minute, but we'll have a chance to talk to each other in the pauses during the webinar. And if you'd be very kind to just introduce yourselves when we come to that point, that would be great.
Yeah, and just to pause you there, Philippa, a couple of housekeeping things. Please just put yourself on mute whilst Philippa is speaking. As Philippa said, we're going to have some pauses throughout the session. So that would be an opportunity to ask questions either in the chat or verbally. It would be great if you could refrain from using the chat whilst Philippa's speaking, just so that we don't stop the flow. There's quite a lot of material to get through, but this is going to be a discursive process at the times that we've allocated for that discussion. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Okay, so welcome. And I've just introduced the CDC team who's managing the webinar this afternoon. The structure, as I've said, is really in 4 parts, but they are completely overlapping. And in addition to that, the focus is on disability and the Equality Act, and primarily on schools. I'll make reference to other duties as we go, but there is a very significant overlap with special educational needs. The language is different, and we'll be looking at that as we go through. I have throughout the webinar, I'm highlighting some of the issues that schools do find particularly tricky to manage. And I'm really not giving a blow-by-blow account of all the duties in all the disability duties in the Equality Act. We have published, alongside this webinar, we've published a school's guide to disability and the Equality Act, and that's on our website, and we've got links to that in the presentation. But it does, the webinar draws very significantly on both on research and on some tribunal decisions, not all recent, but they helpfully illustrate some of the key things which I want to focus on this afternoon. And we've got occasional polls and pauses and opportunities for questions as we go through, and occasional things for you. I'm going to ask you to put into the chat as we go. Just another point, there is sort of connected to each of the 4 sections of this webinar, there is a series of 4 blogs on the CDC website, which kind of, this is a written version of the sorts of issues that we're picking out for this afternoon. So, a quick poll for you. This is not a Zoom poll. This is just, if you would be very kind and pop into the chat, just some kind of estimate of the extent of your knowledge and understanding of the disability duties in the Equality Act. 1, you don't know very much at all, and 5, I already know quite a lot. If you'd be very kind to just pop that into the chat now, it will give me an idea of what the range of understanding and knowledge is amongst those of you who are here at the minute. I can see already that there is quite a range of responses there from people who may know quite a lot through to those who have not really had to engage with this area of our public life before. So I hope that in what I say, you will find things at all levels. Perhaps for those of you who are really quite familiar with the duties, I hope you'll perhaps find something that takes you into a bit more depth in some areas. And for those of you who are new to it, I hope you'll be able to cull from this something of the duties and where the challenges lie, in particular thinking of schools. But thank you for that. It's really helpful to me to understand the range of knowledge and understanding that we've got. So the 4 parts to the webinar focus on, in the first part, disability and difference. Then secondly, you might think this ought to really come first, it's knowing who is disabled. You might think that really is the starting point, but interestingly, there are some issues which perhaps it's easier to tease out in the first section about disability and difference. But then we move on in section 3 to patterns and duties. And then in section 4 to what I've called living the values. This really goes a little bit beyond the duties into a deeper understanding of some of the features of our practices that perhaps don't recognize the underlying values that we risk failing to live up to. So my focus this afternoon is on, really fundamentally, is on schools' duties. But we need to recognise before we start that, of course, there are duties around employment, around the provision of services, on other equalities, and of course on intersectionality, where you have overlapping duties that may be owed to individual children who share protected characteristics with more than one group of other people. And of course, for schools themselves, they have those overlapping duties as well. So I'm really focusing on schools' duties towards disabled pupils. But of course, they have duties under employment to their disabled staff as well. And of course, if we think about early years settings, their disability duties towards the children that they're responsible for arise through the provision of services part of the Equality Act rather than the schools part of the Equality Act. So recognising all those other duties, then I'm really narrowing the focus of this webinar down to schools' duties to disabled pupils under the Equality Act. And there is a link to the guide that I mentioned, that's on our website, and do please have a look at that and use it and disseminate it, take it to people who may need to know about some of this stuff. And CDC also provides training on that. We've provided training to a number of schools on the disability duties in the Equality Act. We've developed, to accompany that, we've developed a self-review tool, which is quite helpful to schools. It follows the same sort of structure as we're talking about here. So in this first part, I want to look at disability and difference. So here, from some work on bullying, I've pulled out some quotes from children who felt they were being bullied because they were disabled. And you can see the responses here. The fact that that disability bit gets in the way of their working relationships with others. So in your letter, there's the word disabled. You put down exactly the reason that we're being bullied. The word disabled explains why we're bullied. And you can see that bit in the exchange between two children on the lower part of the slide. The reason we're getting bullied is because we're in a wheelchair and because you're not like them. Do you know what I mean? And then there's this attempt to tease out, we're all normal, but others don't think so. Really, everybody's the same. So there's this tension between same, our shared humanity, and yet the disability that seemed to single us out as different. And therefore, in this context of looking at bullying, children themselves identifying that their disability as the very reason that they are being bullied. And we do know that disabled children are much more likely to be bullied than their peers. So this tension between, as it were, same shared characteristics and different characteristics is quite significant when we come down to looking even at the definition of special educational needs and at the duties in the Equality Act towards disabled pupils. So there is an issue then about whether, if we emphasize difference, whether we stigmatize children, but whether treating people the same is insensitive to the difference that we need to cater for. And these quotes illustrate that quite nicely. And the quote at the foot there from Lani Florian is about whether, by providing something different or additional for children who experience difficulties in their learning, where inclusive pedagogy seeks to extend what is ordinarily available to everyone. So if, in effect, if we change the nature of what we do for all children, can we actually provide a more inclusive approach that doesn't require that additional or different treatment that we talk about under the special educational needs duties, or the reasonable adjustments that we need to make under the Equality Act duties? Now, I'm going to just change the display on my screen because I can't see the whole of the slide with the display that I currently have. So let me just see if I can change the layout here. Sorry, a bit of a pause while I sort that out. There we go, that's a little bit better there, thank you. I want just to look at some of the research here, because this raises questions for us about that issue of different treatment. So we have some very significant, absolutely massive longitudinal studies which hold a massive wealth of information across significant cohorts of children who've been monitored over the years. And this particular piece of work was led by the London School for Economics and the Institute of Education Centre for Longitudinal Studies. And this particular study was a secondary analysis of the Millennium Cohort Study, which is a group of children who we're monitoring here between the ages of 3 and 5, and then again between the ages of 5 and 7. And this secondary analysis was particularly to pick out children who were identified at a young age as having a special educational need or a disability. Now, this data was already in the massive, great data machine held at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, and so this was reviewing what was in there already. So there was no opportunity to go and ask any direct questions, but the opportunity was to analyze the data that was there from this point of view of young children identified as having a disability or a special educational need. And what the study found was the usual associations that we know about between disability and disadvantage, and between disability and bullying and later adverse health and social problems, and between disadvantage, learning, speech and language, and behavior difficulties. So those problems form the backdrop to this particular study. But what we found in this study was that when we control for prior attainment, by which I mean the point in children's learning and development where they were at the beginning of this process, so they were matched, we're looking at a cohort with the same prior attainment. The cohort is also controlled in terms of home learning environment and socioeconomic status and maternal levels of education, which we know are all key indicators of learning and progress in learning and development. But there was a gap between as children moved from the age of 3 to 5, even where we had matched for all of those prior conditions on the baseline, children fell behind, disabled children fell behind their peers between the ages of 3 and 5. Now, reset that baseline again at the age of 5 and match on all those same criteria, and disabled children fall behind their peers again between the ages of 5 and 7. Now, the research team, remember, we can't ask additional questions. We can, however, look at some of the other data and what that data tells us. And so we know from what I've shared with you already that disabled children have different early experiences of school, with that more likely to have difficulties in behavior, in forming friendships, and in developing language and communication, and in terms of managing behavior. So that might be the explanation for that reduced rate of progress between 3 and 5 and 5 and 7. But the researchers also had another hypothesis that actually this might be related to reduced or compromised expectations on the part of teachers. So when that cohort had grown to their teen years, and at that point children are answering these survey questions themselves in these big cohort studies, the researchers found that children in their teen years, and this is by self-report, by their report, had lower expectations than their peers in terms of their future life chances, for example, by the type of job they expected to get and the likelihood of them going to university. And that reduced expectation related also to families where parents still had high expectations of their disabled children. So there are two possible explanations here. One, that compromised environment in the early years because of those additional difficulties. And secondly, that potential for compromised expectations. So I want to start talking about the requirement to make reasonable adjustments for disabled children. And the reasonable adjustments duty requires us to take such steps as it is reasonable to have to take to avoid placing a disabled child at a substantial disadvantage compared with their non-disabled peers. And substantial disadvantage is something that's a disadvantage that's more than minor or trivial, so relatively easy to put a disabled child at a substantial disadvantage. And the question there is whether it's something that's reasonable for the school to have to do. So it's not something that's going to be very high cost or very impractical to implement. And it's because it's not possible for a school to justify a failure to make a reasonable adjustment, that in a sense, the test is in the reasonableness. So if a school fails to make a reasonable adjustment, then they can't justify that failure because they're not asked to do something that is unreasonable. So because reasonable adjustments require us to do that different treatment bit, I want to go through a little bit more about the duties. The duties are anticipatory. In other words, we have to think ahead, because if we don't put in place a reasonable adjustment, then we risk putting that child at a substantial disadvantage. Now, we owe that duty to every disabled child, but we know a lot from the patterns of what goes wrong for disabled children. We can sometimes have an informed guess, or we can have a understanding of what might happen. And so we can actually think ahead, and we must think ahead to avoid putting that child at a substantial disadvantage. So we have to think about sort of some general considerations about what's reasonable, which are, as I've sort of hinted, the sort of practicability of doing something, the cost maybe. You can take into account health and safety considerations. You can also take into account whether something may be provided through the SEN framework because a child has a special educational need, and that might change what you might need to add into that through a reasonable adjustment because something is already in place. But also the need to make reasonable adjustments changes over time and in different circumstances. It might be, you might need to make reasonable adjustments for a child who has a limited concentration, perhaps. You might need to make adjustments in a maths lesson, for example, but you might not need to make those adjustments in a history lesson, for example, because the child's able to extend their span of concentration in a history lesson in some way because of their particular disability, because of the impact of their particular disability in a way that it might not in other subjects. So it might be in different subjects, different activities, fundamentally, what we want to secure is that disabled children are able to join in all the activities of the school with their peers, that there is nothing that should be a barrier to their joining in all the activities of the school with their peers. And that's fundamentally what the duties in the Equality Act say. Now, the duties also say that a disabled pupil can be treated more favourably than a pupil who is not disabled, and that does not amount to direct discrimination against a pupil who is not disabled. So in the Equality Act, treating someone more favourably than another person may put the other person at a disadvantage, but in the case of disability, treating a disabled pupil more favourably does not put the non-disabled pupil at a disadvantage under the duties. So for a disabled pupil, more favourable treatment might mean, for example, not applying a standard disciplinary sanction. So if you have an infringement of the behaviour policy twice, you get excluded, for example. Some schools have a policy on that kind of nature. So it might be that for a pupil who has a particular disability, that means it's more difficult for them to comply with the behaviour policy, that they have some kind of reasonable adjustment made to that policy to ensure that they're not constantly being excluded. And it might mean allowing variations to school uniform. I think I have an example of that coming up. It might mean providing a small, quiet study area that a pupil can retreat to if they feel that they are uncomfortable in a busier, noisier environment. So I want to move on to think about blanket policies, and what the blanket policies are policies that are applied to all children regardless of their disability. And that causes a problem because we're not allowing for that making of reasonable adjustments for individual pupils whose disability may affect their ability to comply with that policy. So it's applied, if you like, unthinkingly to all pupils. And this is the area where schools are at the greatest risk of discrimination, because for many schools, for many teachers, fairness is thought of as being about treating all pupils the same. Whereas when it comes to the disability duties, the requirement to make reasonable adjustments requires us to treat different pupils differently in order to give them the same opportunities. And that's quite difficult for schools to get their heads around. And that's why this is the biggest danger zone for schools. And it also raises the biggest questions about different treatment and the way that that may single pupils out, and it may actually make adults in particular feel that there is unfairness in bending the rules, as they might say, for one pupil, but not for others. So here's an interesting example, which sounds like a very good policy for a school to have. So it's a healthy snacks policy. And Hannah Godley, this was a real case that went to the tribunal, a very early case that went to the tribunal, because Hannah has diabetes and needed, at particular times during the day, she needed a high-calorie snack to help her to manage her diabetes. Now, she was not allowed to go out into the playground to have her snack, her biscuits or crisps or whatever it was. She was sent to sit and eat her biscuits and or crisps outside the head teacher's office. Now, that was a sort of double disadvantage, if you like, in that one, she was deprived of the opportunity of that recreational time with her friends, her peers, and two, being told to sit outside the head teacher's office is usually a sentence or a punishment. So it felt to her as if she was being punished and not being allowed to eat her snack in the playground with her peers. So I'm inclined in this situation, and the school was found to have discriminated. I'm inclined in this situation to put myself in the position of the staff member on duty in the playground that day, who is then faced with the challenge from children who are saying, why is Hannah allowed to eat her crisps and biscuits in the playground and we're only allowed to have apples and carrots or whatever it is that they're eating? And I think in that situation, my observation would be that children accept difference much more readily than adults do. And a lot of that risk of discrimination grows with us all as we grow up. And I think harder for that adult to explain why than for children to understand why in that situation. So I think the adult in the playground could be saying something like, well, to keep ourselves healthy, we need to eat the apples and carrots. But for Hannah, to keep herself healthy, she needs to have her crisp and biscuit at particular points in the day. And that's to help her to stay healthy. And that might be, children will accept that very readily. And it's the adults in that situation who may not be able to. So whilst that sounds relatively easy to explain to a child, harder perhaps in this example. This is a secondary age pupil who has autism, who has ADHD, and has quite significant communication difficulties arising from his conditions. Now, this is unfortunate because it's a supply teacher who arrives at the classroom that day. And as she arrives at the door, the pupil is standing by the door looking as if he might be about to leave the classroom rather than to go and sit down. And she says to him, "Are you going to sit down?" The pupil says no, because actually at that point, he has no intention of sitting down. And the exchange escalates. It gets to the point where the pupil swears very colourfully at the teacher, and the pupil gets excluded from the school. Now, that was found to be discrimination. So just want to unpick what was happening there. Firstly, the teacher was a supply teacher and had not been briefed by the school on the communication difficulties for that pupil. Adjustments to her language could have prevented that difficulty arising. So if instead of asking, "Are you going to sit down?" if she had said name, addressed the pupil by name and said, "Please sit down," he might well have complied with that request. but framed as a question here, it's not perceived in that pupil's way of communicating to be anything other than an open question. Whereas other kids might read that as a sit down, please. He did not. He saw it as an open question because he had no intention at that point of sitting down. He just said no. The swearing was extremely colourful. It's reported in detail in the tribunal judgment, and you can understand the difficulty for that situation. So the teacher expected that pupil to be excluded because that was part of the school policy. And the language was so colourful that there would be an issue about how the pupils would perceive that situation. So why would he be allowed to get away with that language to the teacher, whereas another pupil might not? Now, given the school had failed to make the necessary adjustments, and therefore this had happened as it had, then the way of presenting that might have been to have adjusted the penalty for that, for the swearing, for the school to be able to demonstrate to other pupils that there was a sanction against that kind of behaviour, to demonstrate it was unacceptable, so that it might perhaps have moderated that penalty and said, well, you need to have a period away from the classroom, and you need to go and spend some time with, I don't know, the Senko or whatever in a different room for a bit. But the very fact that he got excluded from the classroom, never mind the school, would have put him at a substantial disadvantage because he was then missing that lesson. So the importance of that reasonable adjustment is that it's made beforehand. And this raises a lot of questions about ensuring teachers fully understand the adjustments they need to make in each and every lesson for each and every pupil. So quite a challenge there. And I think that's probably a moment to pause and see if there are any questions you wanted to ask at that point. I've cantered through that quite quickly, and so very happy to take a few questions if there are any at that point.
I'll just kick off, actually. Was the exclusion a fixed term exclusion or a permanent exclusion?
No, it was a fixed term exclusion. Yeah, it was a second or third fixed term exclusion for that particular pupil. And as you can imagine, there were all sorts of other things happening in that situation. The individual plan for that pupil was about a year out of date, I think. It had not been reviewed and adjusted in the meantime. And an autism outreach worker had been to the school and provided some advice the year before, but that had not been shared widely. There are all sorts of other things there, and inevitably any case goes to the tribunal. It's rarely a simple thing because that might be resolved before the case goes to the tribunal. But no, good point, Christina. Any other questions at that point? There'll be other points for questions. So if you've got things that subsequently get answered, fine. But if they subsequently become more of a question, then come back at the next point.
Philippa, can
Yes.
I just say, a lot of school behaviour policies don't follow the guidance that DFE have provided, which says that they have the policy has to be written with regards to the Equality Act and must allow for reasonable adjustments. And many of the policies that I come across in my work, there's absolutely no reference to that at all.
Yes, and that is the problem with a blanket policy. And that's the most likely way in which schools trip up. And I've got an example coming up, Dana, of precisely that, a school where sanctions were applied automatically to a pupil who had known special educational needs. Is further complicated by the fact that they didn't recognise that his special educational needs amounted to a disability under the Equality Act, and so they therefore thought of him as just a badly behaved kid rather than a kid who needed some adjustments made for them. And there are all sorts of things that can create those sorts of problems, particularly where you have very detailed sort of behavior codes with disciplinary sanctions set against them. So, for example, for you know, top button being done up on a shirt and that sort of thing. And interesting, I was in a school, secondary school, a couple of months ago, where they got a really brilliant set of reasonable adjustments to help pupils move between lessons. They had a lot of pupils on the autism spectrum, and who found it very difficult to move around the school at busy times, lesson changeover, etc. And they had a really fantastic array of adjustments that were made to help pupils through that. You could leave early, you could arrive late, you could go with friends, you could go on your own. All those sorts of things were built into it. And they had adjusted their uniform policy to avoid any of those issues about kids who find a particular colour very difficult or problematic, or particular fabrics that irritate their skin. And so that's so schools do know about this stuff, or they should know about this stuff, and yet we still get these behaviour policies which are so specific and so prescribed and applied unthinkingly and without adjustments. So it doesn't surprise me. Colleagues who don't know, Diana often sits on independent review panels reviewing exclusions, and she sits there as the SEN expert. So has obviously seen a lot of these cases where exclusions have arisen because of some kind of infringement of an inflexible behaviour policy. So thanks for raising that, Diana. Good point.